Okay, folks, welcome to the latest installment of Reviewing the Future. What is the future that I am talking about? Well, it is the one of the latest books by Stefan Molyneux. And Stefan Molyneux is an Irish-born Canadian anarcho-capitalist podcaster who promotes philosophy, non-aggressive parenting, stateless societies, and hard-boiled scientific empiricism. That is my definition for him. If you go to Wikipedia or one of these sites, you're going to find some hit piece material. So trust me, I tell you this. Now, how to find Stefan Molyneux online in case you want to experience him for yourself. You can look at any one of these sites, especially subscribe to his freedomain.locals.com site if you want to pick up a copy of his book, The Future, which is what we are going to be reviewing. And this book, The Future, is to Stefan Molyneux what Ayn Rand's Atlas Shrugged is to Ayn Rand. It's basically the magnum opus of his philosophy. And so let's get right into it with a recap taking us up through chapter 7. 95% of humanity has perished in a 4 centuries-long war that ended when automated drones put an end to weapons of mass destruction. The survivors have since created a near utopian society commonly called the Civ, made possible by peaceful parenting, in which parents raise kids without aggression, like yelling or spanking or timeouts, or really any kind of discipline. It's all done through negotiation and morals and mutual agreements. Two girls raised in this near utopia go hiking and unexpectedly encounter two boys who are members of a survivalist society living entirely apart from the Civ, a society which parents the old way. The boys verbally and physically abuse the girls, then depart. The traumatized girls return to the Civ. Now, there's no sexual abuse at this point, but one of them does get slapped and the other one does get punched in the stomach. Now, Chapter 8 deals with the Civ's plan for response. The Civ is run by dispute resolution organizations, one of which is headed, I think, by David, the father of Alice, one of the girls who was abused on the mountain. I don't know if David's actually the head of the DRO in this case. I kind of wrote this up thinking that he was, but when I went back, I was like, I don't really know that for sure, and I couldn't find a particular line of text that defined him as such. So he may be the head of it, he may not be. So far it hasn't come up as being important. David is described as a tall man with side-swept, thinning, sandy hair. Now, if you've been following along with my prior videos, you might remember that David was introduced all the way back in Chapter 2, so why is this the first time that he's been physically described? I mean, generally speaking, when you encounter a character for the first time in any meaningful way, you describe the character at that point, at least trivially, so that you describe a few characteristics to make that character appear in the reader's mind. And yet, it turns out that for the last 6 or 7 chapters, we haven't actually had any kind of picture of David having been given. So, kind of like, really? Because it does wind up being very noticeable if you start adding details now, because what you're going to find is that the reader is going to create an image in his or her mind, and then you're going to add these physical details and wind up contradicting that reader's image. That's really not the way you want to go about doing things. David addresses the heads of the other DROs. Although his own daughter was involved in the incident, David swears, "I'm approaching this from a totally moral UPB perspective." Now, what is UPB? We have no freaking clue. We're not even told what UPB stands for in this chapter. This is Chapter 8. It's not until Chapter 12 that we finally learn the term universally preferable behavior. So, what the heck is this universally preferable behavior? Universally preferable. This is why they call it UPB, by the way. Because you can't say the freaking thing. Okay, so what is this UPB thing? Well, is it even important to the book? Well, yeah, because just like Atlas Shrugged is to Ayn Rand what this book is to Stefan Molyneux, the point of Atlas Shrugged is to communicate her philosophy of objectivism through the story and through the characters. And in the same way, Stefan Molyneux's book, The Future, is supposed to communicate this universally preferable behavior to the readers. So the fact that you don't even tell us what it stands for another 5 chapters, I mean, that's just kind of insane. Now, universally preferable behavior is explained in Molyneux's book of the same name, and I have actually made a review of that book. If you look for it, it will be in my Don't Take This as Gospel playlist. It's entry number 30. So if you look up DTTAG number 30, you will find my review of the book Universally Preferable Behavior. And this book explains that UPB is a system of empirically derived ethics based wholly in logic and evidence without any appeal to religious or state authority. It's basically an observational view of morality, looking at the world and abstracting principles from the behavior we see around us, and basically constructing a set of ethics based on that. Now, David's arguments in this planning the response, he's basically trying to motivate the Civ into a response, and these are some of the arguments that he uses. If adults want to stay out of our society, that's up to them. But those boys were children, and they don't have any choice. And the choices their parents are making will keep them out of the Civ forever. That's argument number 1. The parents are obviously mistreating the hell out of their children, which creates the usual violence and addiction and promiscuity, and with that promiscuity comes additional babies, all of whom are going to be treated badly. Their birth rate is probably way higher than ours. This won't be the last time we collide. Next argument. We're just going to have to fast forward our own history with this new clan, bring them here, teach them peaceful parenting, find a way to accelerate their development. Lastly, come on, if you or I or any of us were stuck out there as kids picking out our own sticks to be beaten with, some of you may actually have experienced this way of parenting, wouldn't we want the modern cavalry to ride to our rescue? Now, David is obviously basing his arguments on some key assumptions here, one of which being there's nothing better than life in the Civ. And of course, Stefan Molyneux is presenting the Civ as being a near utopian society as opposed to survivalist society. But here's the thing, David is so certain of his of the superiority of life in the Civ to anything else that he is actually willing to stamp out another society's way of life for it, basically by stealing their children. Contrary to Star Trek, which is what a lot of people take as a utopian view of humanity's future, there's no prime directive in this future society. There's no live and let live. And part of that has to do with the fact that, of course, if you go to another society and they don't have warp drive, if you're just looking at a pre-warp civilization, then they're not going to be getting to you anytime soon. You can basically avoid them and say, their planet is off limits. You don't have to do anything about them. It's the warp drive societies like the Klingons and the Romulans and then all other kinds of spacefaring species that can actually come into contact with you. And so in those cases, you actually do need to confront and negotiate with those particular species. But still, when you look at it from a kind of, colonialist perspective, it seems like David is viewing things in a very colonial style. Another assumption that David makes is that children transmit values. And here he agrees with another character in the book, the power-mad former president of the United States, Louis Staton, who David is actually in the process of reviving from a cryogenic sleep, a centuries-long cryogenic sleep, for study. Staton believes that social victory is obtained by outbreeding your opponents, and that's basically what he's saying that the savages or the survivalists would be able to do. The Civ's birth rates are exceedingly low because its residents plan childbearing very carefully. Consequently, nearly no children are available for adoption, and David's family actually ran into this when their oldest daughter died, and they looked around for a child to adopt and couldn't find one. Thankfully, they already had their other daughter, Alice, or else they would have been completely childless at that point. So in a breeding race between the civvies and the savages, I'm calling them, the savages will easily win. Now, the possibility of more cataclysms, this is another of David's assumptions, the possibility of more cataclysms, that's the name for the wars that preceded the founding of the Civ, that overrides all other concerns. And any potential clash of cultures must be preempted, or else humanity may self destruct. Now, this kind of smacks of climate alarmism. It's like, give us control of everything, or the Earth is going to burn. Can there really be no other civilized response than to basically stamp out the society or convince them to give up their way of life? It just seems like it's overkill from the beginning. Now, chapter 9 goes into preparing a response. And the DROs coordinate their security forces, which only amount to a few hundred persons across all of the DROs. And that's partly because the population is so small. I mean, basically 5% of the population was all that was left after the cataclysms. Now, who knows exactly how many people are actually in the world? That's one of the things that isn't really defined, and it is kind of a world-building problem that I find in this book, because without a way to gauge what the population is, you kind of wonder, well, how many people actually live in this world, and how many people live in this civilization specifically. But in any case, the violence in the Civ is almost non-existent, therefore there's really not a need for this security force to be extensive. So the DROs are going to coordinate their security forces to search for the Society of Survivalists. Now, David is in charge of the use of force guidelines, which start at contact and negotiation and escalate all the way up to self-defense and defense of the survivalist children, because basically the way that the survivalists are parenting their children is seen as a threat to the children and a threat to the children's ability to join the Civ at some later stage. David equates self-defense with defense of the survivalist children because these children, if not defended from their parents' abuse, will grow up to threaten the Civ and all humanity, and not only that, but they will be locked out of the Civ themselves as being too violent to admit. David is pessimistic that any attempted negotiation with the survivalists will be fruitful. He says, "The more primitive the tribe, the more control they want to keep over their children. It's the only way to keep that tribal mindset going. So they're not going to give up their kids, and they are not going to want to reform their culture into anything civilized." I mean, you can almost feel the kind of like North American attitude of the European colonizers toward the Native Americans in this paragraph. It's hard not to make that association when you think about it. And what's ironic is that one of the things that frontier society back in the day, back when the Americas were not fully settled, is that Americans were embarrassed to find that there were some of their people who were going over to join the Native Americans because they enjoyed the Native American lifestyle better. so this is kind of interesting to see this kind of colonial mindset at work. Chapter 10 is an excursion into terms of service, and it goes back to focusing on Alice, who was one of the victims of the boys' assault during the hiking expedition. And upon learning that the Survivalist Society has so far thwarted all the Civ's attempts at detecting them, Alice contemplates venturing to find them herself, without her parents' permission. And the possibility of implicitly disobeying her parents and violating her own sense of empathy in the process. And remember, in peaceful parenting, the whole point is to encourage and heighten empathy in the child, to basically make the child care about the parents' feelings, so that obedience is not a function of fear of the parents, as though there was something bad that the parents are going to do. I mean, like a lot of people growing up, they're afraid that, well, if I do that, I'll get a spanking. If I do that, my mom and dad will yell at me. If I do that, I'll be put in timeout. If I do that, I'll be sent to bed without supper. So there's all of these negative consequences that could be imposed on the child by the parents, and that is how the parents maintain their control of the child. But in peaceful parenting, none of that is available to the parents. Parents are expected instead to speak with the children, to encourage the child's own sense of morality and sense of empathy, so that children obey out of a desire not to want to offend other people, especially the parents. The parents treat the child lovingly. Why would not the child treat the parents lovingly in return? And basically it is a mutual relationship that is encouraged on almost an adult level, so that even though the children are still the responsibility of the parents, there is not this domineering of the parents over the children. Rather, the quote unquote control that the parent has over the child is by basically making an appeal to the child's empathy, saying, well, how would it feel if I were to do the same to you? You just treated me like this. How would you feel if I treated you like that? Now, this possibility of implicitly disobeying her parents and violating her own sense of empathy in the process triggers a memory of a story she heard about a child whose sense of empathy was medically determined to not be developing properly. See, in the CIV, all children from a very early age are subjected to non-invasive scans that map their brain activity so that their neurological progress can be tracked. In the case of a normal empathic development, a child will eventually be granted insurance against indemnity for any societal misbehavior, since the scans are showing that this misbehavior is going to be extremely unlikely in that child's case. The more empathy that you have, the less you're going to disobey your parents and get into situations in which you are going to find yourself causing damage to society, hurting other people, etc., etc. And so you can be granted insurance in those cases. But in the case of frustrated empathic development, where a child does not normally develop, a child will be denied insurance, and the child's parents will be expected to assume all costs of restitution for any misbehavior on the part of the child. And that gives the parents incentive to raise the child peacefully, because through that peaceful parenting process, you will develop an empathic child, a child who is caring about the needs of others and will not go off into selfish behavior that causes damage to society. If the parents refuse to have their children scanned, or if the scans detect mistreatment or neglect, the parents can be penalized in various ways. They could be fined, they could have their credit rating impacted, they could have their children taken away, and the parents might even be forcibly subjected to scans themselves. And it's in the contract that these parents have signed with the DROs. So in order to be in this civilization, which is run by DROs, you have to sign a contract with a particular dispute resolution organization. And that contract is going to put these kinds of penalties and fines and damage to your credit rating and possibility of a visit from CPS, and even having yourself subjected to scans. It's all in your contract, and you are volunteering yourself for all of this. This is considered a voluntary contract, and it's kind of scary when you start reading about this part, because you think about all of the time you've signed a company's terms of service, like Amazon, like Google, or any of these places, and you have no idea what you're signing yourself up for. And imagine being told that, hey, you have to submit now to a non-invasive, granted, but a medical procedure that you may not want. And now you have to submit. And it's almost like, it's so funny that when I think of the times that he's railed a bit against vaccination mandates, and now you have these scan mandates in his book, it just seems kind of like, what if people don't want the kind of procedures that you're basically wanting to subject them to? There's a little bit, it just feels a little bit contradictory there. Now, in this story that she was recalling about the child who did not develop properly, a doctor in the story, Alice Hurd, explains, "We didn't become a peaceful society without enforcing peaceful parenting. Your contract clearly states, let's go back to that for a moment. Basically, they're saying that we didn't become a peaceful society without controlling how you parent your children. That's kind of interesting, and we'll get more into that later. Your contract clearly states, your contract, this is the contract they signed, which this contract, you will see, is defining the parent's own relationship with their children. Your contract clearly states that while your children are your responsibility, they don't belong to you. Imagine that. Imagine a business telling you what the relationship between you and your children are. This is an amazing leap here. And Alice also remembers her uncle saying, peaceful parenting is the most revolutionary act in human history because raising children well was the end of a tyranny. Now, I'm still a little bit just blown away. Chapter 11, A Decision Made. Now, resolving that going back to the mountain will, at worst, help her cope with the trauma she endured, and at best, help the Civ locate the survivalist society and rescue its children from parental abuse, Alice determines to make the journey. She is going to go back to the mountain in the hopes that she can succeed where the Civ has failed. She packs supplies for the trip and sneaks out of the house into a summoned sky taxi. 90 minutes later, Alice calls her mother. She's found the society. Then they find her. The call abruptly ends. Cliffhanger. All right, so what impression have I gotten from all of this so far? Dude, you gotta read The Room. Oh my goodness. We are presently living in a society where parents are increasingly trying to homeschool their kids because public schools are indoctrinating them with values contrary to their parents' values, even to the point of insisting children should be able to change their identities and even change their anatomy without their parents' permission. And governments are even seeing fit to take children away from parents who won't respect their children's wishes for permanent body modification. You know what I'm talking about, right? I don't have to say it. And they are even denying prospective foster or adoptive parents access to children needing homes if those prospective parents will not agree to raise the children according to government values, not their own values, not as if the children belong to the parents or anything, but the government is the one who is supposed to define the values that parents have toward their children. Moreover, technology is enabling people who don't comport with government values to be driven out of the public square and even public banking with the assistance of tech companies and their terms of service. So you get into one of these companies like Amazon. You know, I know StixHexam or 666 talks about how he doesn't want to get a Microsoft PC, and the reason being is that Microsoft is going to, with Windows 11, start storing everybody's stuff in the cloud. And that means Microsoft basically owns all your stuff and can deny your stuff to you. If Microsoft doesn't like what it says in a particular book, kind of like they've changed the works of what's his name, Roald Dahl, who I think wrote the Oz books, or maybe it was not Alice in Wonderland, but there were other books as well. Where people have actually been going in and, on account of political correctness, been changing these books to say things other than what they actually say. Now imagine if for some reason you go back to your copy of To Kill a Mockingbird and every occasion of the N-word in that book has been changed to literally N-word. That is something that could actually happen with the technology that exists now. Especially if if you're reliant upon digital books for all your reading. So it's just, we are in this society in which parents are scared. And now imagine you're writing a novel about a near perfect future society, and your dream society essentially takes every fear presently torturing concerned parents who want to remain true to their values and, more importantly, raise their children in those values, and puts those fears on steroids. Remember, these are all quotes from the characters in the book talking about how they view the survivalists. The more primitive the tribe, the more control they want to keep of their children. Doesn't basically it's like, okay, if you want to control what's going into your children's head, you're primitive and you're tribal. You have a primitive tribal mindset. So they're not going to give up their kids, and they're not going to want to reform their culture into anything civilized, as if a civilized culture is one where people give up their kids. We're just going to have to fast forward our own history with this new clan. Bring them here, teach them peaceful parenting, find a way to accelerate their development, as if you're dealing with some kind of lower life form that you now have to bring up to a new level of evolution. If adults want to stay out of our society, that's up to them, but children don't have any choice, and the choices their parents are making will keep them out of the Civ forever, as if being in the Civ is what everyone should want, and certainly what everyone should want for their kids. We didn't become a peaceful society without enforcing peaceful parenting. You know, we didn't become this utopia without controlling how you and your children relate with one another. While your children are your responsibility, they don't belong to you. Oh my goodness. So where is the motivation for this coming from? You've got this near utopian society that essentially severs the essential bond between the parent and the child. And what is behind the curtain providing, or that is provoking this vision of a society in Molyneux's mind? Well, it's a wish from his own childhood. It's especially evinced in David's quote, "Come on, if you or I or any of us were stuck out there as kids picking out our own sticks to be beaten with, wouldn't we want the modern cavalry to ride to our rescue?" See, Stefan Molyneux grew up in an intensively abusive household. He was left by an absentee father to his insane mother's devices. There were no friends coming to his rescue. There were no family coming to his rescue, no social workers. And consequently, this near utopian society he envisions in the future is the society into which he wishes he himself could have been born. A society that wouldn't have viewed the relationship between parent and child, between his mother and himself, as so sacrosanct that it couldn't be interfered with, even when the relationship was obviously detrimental and even dangerous to the child. Yet, in a world where parents now fear losing their children to a corrupt society, a society with corrupt values, Molyneux is giving this gospel out saying, your children don't belong to you. You need to give them to society. What the hell? Now, why would the society care about children in the first place, you might ask? You know, what is it that is making us think that the society would be caring towards children? Now, back in chapter 3, after all, David and Alice, when they're talking, they discuss how collective parenting, which is kind of what you think might be going on here in the sense of the Civ interfering with these parental relationships. David and Alice discuss how collective parenting ultimately doesn't work because we always tend to invest more in our own children, and if we don't know who our children are specifically, or don't care, those children tend to be uncared for. But now you've got this whole society that believes all children ultimately belong to it, in that they can override these parent-child relationships at their discretion. Why would that society be thought to be more caring toward children rather than less on account of the collective parenting caveat? And the answer is because it benefits the society itself to care. According to the doctor in the story that Alice heard about the child who didn't develop properly, children without empathy grow into adults that cost 5 to 10 times more than they ever produce. Consequently, there's nothing sacred about the relationship between parent and child that overrides society's self-interest in protecting itself from the effects of bad parenting. You're basically relying upon the self-interest of society to convert itself into an interest in children. Now, there is a counterpoint, of course, to all of this, which is honor your father and mother, straight out of the Bible. There is supposed to be this sacredness to the parent child relationship from a religious point of view. It's probably going to come as no surprise that there's really no room for religion or God or anything like that in the paradigms of universally preferable behavior. So now we get into what I'm calling the dark prerequisite for utopia. Question: why does the near extinguishing of humanity precede the Civ? This is a very important question. It's not a question that really gets asked up front. It's just basically assumed, and it almost happens as if a miracle occurs, that humanity plunges into these hundreds of years long wars, during which 95% of the population gets wiped out. And it requires that, practically. You think it requires that in order to establish the utopia later. Why is it that we just didn't more and more gradually develop toward this utopia that Stefan Molyneux is promising, and just get there? Generally speaking, I mean, think about it. We've gone from a world in which people used to be able to kill their kids at will, pretty much, or left them out to die if they were as if they were expendable, and now we don't allow that anymore. We used to have slavery all over the globe, and Western civilization has largely put an end to that, even though it still exists in some areas of the world. And some can say it exists clandestinely still throughout humanity, even though publicly and legally it is no longer allowed in a good majority of the world. So we have that. We have the ideas of contracts between the workers and their employers, as opposed to the harsh conditions of the serfs bound to their lords. We have things like democracy now in the world as a substitute for monarchy and oligarchy. And we have all of this development, and yet, for some reason, it seems like the bleak opening of the book, in which you have this massive die-off of the human population, it seems to be kind of a prerequisite for utopia. Why would that be? The answer is because our present society can't progress towards the Civ. Every boon, think about it, every boon that the near utopia of the future offers is only granted through the confirmation of present-day humanity's worst fears. Your children are not your own, and society can and will take them away from you if it thinks necessary. Moreover, your religion is morally bankrupt for assigning special protection to the parent-child relationship. How dare this God tell you to honor your father and mother? What you want for your child is not nearly as important as what society wants for your child. So there's no rational path to get to the Civ from our present society, because there's no rational path from wanting to raise one's children without the interference of corrupt, reading self-interested elites, to voluntarily subjecting one's parenting to the judgment of benevolent, which is still self-interested by Molyneux's definition, elites. Remember, the Civ is acting out of self-interest. And we're looking at our current corrupt governments as acting out of self-interest as well. So why is it that we would ever surrender our judgment over our children to these elites, unless we have been brainwashed in some way to think that they are now benevolent as opposed to corrupt? There's just no way to get there. The only way that's going to happen is if there's going to be some kind of apocalypse. Moreover, you can't get from religion and statehood to secular statelessness. That's something that you're going to wind up finding out probably later in the book. But these two entities are, in Molyneux's eyes, completely opposed to universally preferable behavior. You can't have a god in UPB. You can't have the state in UPB, because both of those concepts introduce categories of person, governing officials, authorities, to one might say, that contradict the universal nature of ethics. So you can't go from having authority to having no authority, which is what the secular statelessness is all about. It's basically the concept is in an anarchy based society, which is what anarcho capitalists view as an ideal society, there are still rules, but there are no rulers who enforce those rules as if they were above the law, enforcing the law. Everything is done through voluntary agreements, and everyone is on the same level. You do not have less status than, say, an official of some sort. You are all engaged in the same kinds of relationships, and if you have ceded control of yourself to someone else voluntarily, well, then, that was your decision, as opposed to the state where you're born into that kind of subject state. So basically, before this heaven on earth utopia can be established, there must come the apocalypse. Because not only do you need the majority of what I guess he would consider brainwashed human society to die off, but you would also need to have all current social systems overturned to the point where you can establish a brand new sort of society based on this universally preferable behavior, which is still not really sure how in the world you expect that to come into play, because when you look at places that have actually descended into anarchy, like South Africa, places like various African and Middle Eastern countries, and you look at what happens there, how you see the societies devolve into tribal warlords and those kinds of more primitive social structures. The idea that somehow you can evolve from what humanity is into Molyneux's vision of what humanity could be is so bleak as to be ridiculous. And I feel like it's almost logically inconsistent to propose that you have to plunge the world into absolute utter darkness before you can find the light. I don't think it works that way. I think this is the lazy way out. But I don't know, maybe there's something later in the book that's going to change my mind. So thank you for being along with me for this installment of Reviewing the Future. When we get into the next chapter, we're going to have David searching for his daughter Alice and finding out about her fate, and will he have to make a deal with the devil going forward in order to secure not only his daughter's future, but the future in general. So thanks again for watching. I'm Mike Bartica. Please do subscribe so that you'll get notified when further installments of this and my other videos come out. And I will see you later.